thank you, all of you, for this amazing event. Thank you, Maya, for putting this together. I guess this specific subject of interdependence is something that we need particularly today, and this is what we're going to talk about with Evgeny today. So you have already noticed that I'm French, based on my accent. But for the purpose of the conversation that we will have with Evgeny later on, I'll do this talk in English, and I'm sorry for this. So the subject that we do have to tackle together are the new frontiers, the new territories of interdependence. And I must say that something really struck me this morning. It has been said that as soon as we acknowledge the fact that we do need to understand that interdependence allows us to work together, to basically need each other to be able to do things that we couldn't do alone. It's exactly what I have in mind and what I want to talk about in this talk, meaning that it got to my mind that I've actually never done anything alone. And myself, my background is in economics, in philosophy, history of art. But somehow I end up teaching future imaginaries and having a company in which we work on AI, space, technology, and climate action. So obviously I was able to do this kind of project and to work towards the project I'm going to present to you because every time I'm working with amazingly talented people, and together we work on these new challenges that we do face today. Something that I do believe in is that if we are able to work together from all of these different disciplines, for instance, within my organization, we come from, I don't know, maybe all the disciplines that we can imagine, it's because we do have one thing in common, at least one common view of the world that I would just like to start with. This subject of interdependence to me was, I don't know if we have the video of this, maybe, was actually really related to an image that I'm sure you know of Buckminster Fuller. Buckminster Fuller had this view of the dim action map in the 50s, a specific overview that led to see the world in a specific way, a way in which we do see not the frontiers but the bridges. We do envision the world as a single island on a single ocean in a single universe, in a way. And I guess this very idea of interconnection, of interdependence, to me, is striking specifically in this image, is that from all over the world, wherever we come from whatever background, we are basically engaged in the same ship, working to solve the same challenges. And I'm going to show you some projects that we do work on, and I think are going into this, at least my view of new territories for interdependence. So we do face, I guess, based on this same planet, same challenges. I work quite often with the United Nations in charge of the AI for Good Commission. And we work towards the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that I'm sure a lot of you know. In 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals were set by the United Nations to show what big challenges we face, us as humanity, for 2030. Obviously, when you look at it, it's a lot of challenge to cope with, but you do see maybe two things that are really interesting to me. The first one is how interdependent the challenges are with one another. You cannot work on climate change with the Objective 13 without working also on water access. You cannot work on quality of education if you don't work on a simpler mobility. So this real interconnection between all of these huge challenges for the future make it necessary to work together from all of the disciplines and find solutions to it, or at least approach solutions. And the other thing that I want to strike on this matrix of the SDGs is to show you that the objective, the last objective actually, the 17th one, is about partnership. Meaning that it is acknowledged that to pursue all of these goals, one of the major goals, maybe it would have been the objective 0 or 1, I guess, is to be able to set partnerships and to try and find new framework for collaboration in the future between the UN agencies and worldwide, between everyone who's engaging in this subject. So it's been 3 years now that we've created with ITU, the UN Agency for Telecommunication, the AI for Good Global Summit. Next week it's going to be the 3rd edition. So each year we tackle 3 different SDGs and we try and see how AI can obviously not solve a problem, but help us human beings approach a problem and define parts of the solutions for the future. I want to just share with you a simple example that I actually discovered through the commission and with which I'm engaged now specifically. So it's about satellite imagery, AI and SDGs. It's a lot to take on, but it's going to be fast, I promise. A little bit of history that I think is really amazing is that this is the first satellite who took a picture of Earth in 1959. It's called Corona. It was set by the US, and the little picture that you see over there is kind of poetic but useless, technology-wise, because it's a cloud over the sea. Obviously, you don't know what to do with this kind of image, black and white and so on. The good news is that with this acceleration of technology, we've been able, since 2012, to have much more precise quality of image, thanks to the satellite Pleiad of the CNES, for instance. We do have images, precise, high definition of a meter square of Earth. So you might tell me that's great, but what should we do with it? Obviously, as soon as we have so many information, so many quality identification of problems on Earth, we can do a lot of things. But first, we need to collaborate, not only with humans, but with machines also. Why is that? Because if my friends over there would have to analyze all the images that we grasp through this satellite, basically playing Where's Waldo on one image to another by hand, being a single human, or even if we are 7 billion working on this specific subject, it would be impossible to grasp the pattern and analyze because of the repetitiveness and the fact that basically machines are best suited to do this task. This is an example of how computer vision algorithm can basically analyze data, this satellite imagery, and show patterns to improve the quality, learn from what has happened in the past few years, and anticipate what could happen. So for which cases do we use this kind of algorithms and data? Well, a lot of those challenges are related to climate action, obviously. On the causes of climate action, for instance, we are obviously well suited to analyze cases of deforestation from space, way easier than we would do with human beings on the ground. But we are also able to learn from what's happened in the past few years in terms of flood, for instance, and be able to, if not predict at every time, to contain more of the floods that are happening in the future. It's also really useful to be able to analyze the quality of the soil and be able, for instance, to propose micro-insurances and so on in countries that wouldn't have this opportunity. So we discovered with these different projects that basically a lot of the sustainable development goals could be tackled through a collaboration of different UN agencies, different disciplines, knowledge, and through a collaboration with machines, algorithms. But what we understood also is that the very first basic need that we do have is to work as humans together, to share data, algorithms, best practices, and work commonly for the common good. This is why last year we created the AI Commons. That is the first platform worldwide to share data and algorithms for the common good. It's a system of licenses that enables any organization to share data and select the kind of subject that they want to tackle, the kind of SDG. And this is all about working for the common good in commons. So for those of you in the art world, it's kind of a creative commons for data and algorithms in a way. And to end up with this kind of few really short examples before we get to Evgeny's presentation and a discussion together, I wanted to say that it's obvious to us when we work on this kind of subject that we are stronger together. That it's easier, obviously, to work in common and not separately to solve problems that are global. But in a way, the problem that we face is not a technical problem, it's not an intelligence problem, it is an imaginary problem, a problem of imagination. That most of us still believe in a world of competition instead of cooperation. And this is why I think we need to push forward new imaginaries and to bring in new stories about the future. This is where I'm really interested in artworks of our days, tackling speculative works of the future and the collaboration between humans and nature, humans and machines. One of them, obviously, is about the interspecies translator of Thomas Saraceno that enables us to have another overview on how to communicate maybe in the future with machines, a speculative work that is wonderful to try and understand how to communicate and build projects with other kind of beings. And also Rocio Berenguer, who works on this G5 interspecies commission, in which she tries to transfer what's happened in a G5 reunion commission and apply it to all species alive, whether it be mineral, vegetal, animal, human, and machines. How would we basically agree on working together, sharing resources to have a better life, all of us together, and not just us humans on the ground? And what I find really interesting is that those projects don't come only from artists. We see a lot of amazing interdisciplinary work in different labs worldwide. One of them, and I'll end with this example, is from Professor Kubota in Tama University in Japan, who works on this idea of understanding better natural intelligence through human analysis and machine help, in which he wants to work into understanding the processes of decision-making of different kind of beings, so that collectively, being more intelligent, we could see the world without frontiers everywhere, but more of bridges, and to understand at last that this beautiful world, definitely through complexity, looks like a labyrinth, but with no wall. Thank you so much. So this was an intro to the kind of stuff I'm working on, but I'd love to welcome Evgeny to present what's your view of the new territories of the needs of interdependence, and I'll hope to get into a conversation with all of you later on.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's, of course, a pleasure to be here. I always love coming here to Arles. It's not my first visit. I hope I'll keep coming. Those of you who know my work probably know me as the harbinger of bad news. But since we are in such marvelous settings here in Arles, I would actually make an exception and start with a piece of good news. And the good news is that I think for the first time in recent history, digital technologies, from big data to artificial intelligence to ubiquitous sensors, actually have allowed us to glimpse the kind of future where society and institutions could be remade and reshaped according to a very different decentralized logic. For the first time, I think we have actually seen that a transportation system or an education system or even a healthcare system potentially can be organized in a far less technocratic, hierarchical, centralized manner, just by taking advantage of all the potential for collaboration and communication that information technology introduces. Instead of having one centralized system where everything is dictated from above, we can actually have a much more decentralized system where communicating units, whether those are citizens or entrepreneurs or providers of services like transportation, can actually offer those services without having to depend on a big centralized structure of some kind, right? And I think that gets us closer to the utopia of a more humane, more decentralized society where the providers of services are much closer to those using them. But I think that future, left to its own devices, is not going to arrive on its own, right? And this is where the good news, unfortunately, ends. That the path on which we are right now does not favor the emergence of that future. Imagine, I said that these technologies have allowed us to glimpse into that future, but they're not making it possible. It will not arrive on its own unless we take some drastic measures. And let me tell you what is likely to happen if we don't take them. So as you hear all the buzz around the sharing economy and the gig economy and artificial intelligence and the platforms, I think it's very common to imagine that they are that future that I have just presented. that they are going to give us a world that is more humane, more sustainable, there will be far less waste and inefficiency, and we will use digital technologies like Uber or Airbnb to take advantage of our existing resources much more cleverly. I would challenge that picture. If you look, those of you on your mobile phones right now or on your computers, go to Google Images and search for just two terms, bike sharing in China. And as you do that, I can tell you that the very first 3 or 4 results that you see when you Google on images for bike sharing in China would be giant piles of bikes that have been abandoned by the service providers of bike sharing that actually tried but failed to win in the market for shared mobility services. If you go and look at some of the recent studies about Uber and Lyft and the impact on transportation, some of the studies from Los Angeles, for example, show that the actual rates of traffic and congestion have increased by up to 40% because Uber and Lyft cars are actually clogging the streets of Los Angeles. Right? So the promises of sustainability and efficiency, they are just promises. Right? But that's not to do with the nature of those technologies. That's mostly to do with the ways in which and by whom those technologies are being deployed right now. What we have to understand is that the world of digital technologies is not just about creating these new ways of organizing and coordinating. It's also a way of reinserting the global into the local. Right? If you look at the term the internet, that idea of something being not necessarily interdependent but interconnected is already there in that very term. And what has happened, I would argue, in the last 15 years is that as we discovered the radical potential of these technologies, some actors have also discovered the radical profitability and the fact that you can actually go and offer one service, and because we are all now part of this global network, you can offer that service everywhere on exactly the same terms as it has been offered before. So we end up with rather homogenized services like Uber or Airbnb that essentially serve the same function everywhere, that are built once, and that seek to conquer and homogenize the potential of this new technological revolution. Right? It's not that Uber in Latin America looks different from Uber in Asia. It's exactly the same offering that you would get if you went from McDonald's to McDonald's. You might actually get more variety as you visit McDonald's because they actually do try to match some and introduce some regional variation. What I would like you to take away from this talk is that our idea of this sharing and gig economy is completely erroneous. What is driving it right now is not the idea of centralization, but the idea of centralization, right? Which is driven either by the providers of the services or by the people and institutions funding them. I remember that 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, I went to one of the conferences that is familiar to many people in Ireland, or at least in this room, to DLD, and we have Steffi, the curator, here in the room with us. And I remember that I complained about venture capitalists being some kind of parasites on modern society. And I think that I wish we were in that world in 2019. I'm kind of very nostalgic for that world, because the idea that investors can take risks, wait for 10 years, and then see their project deliver or not deliver, it's almost no longer with us. Right now, we see massive centralization of funding behind institutions like the SoftBank, which has $100 billion to spend on Uber, Airbnb, any of those services, and they can afford to sustain whatever losses, because these institutions became so huge that the idea that we compete on how good the service is or how sustainable it is, it no longer makes any sense. These institutions compete on how much money they can keep on losing. And if they manage to lose more money than their competitors, they survive and they continue. And if not, they go out of business, and we are left with a pile of abandoned bikes, as in China. So Uber lost $4.5 billion in 2017. And in 2018, they lost $1.8 billion. How can you possibly compete locally with an institution like that? Right? There is no creativity, no sustainability, no some kind of local genius that can actually disrupt them if these institutions can sustain such losses, right? So this idea that somehow we have investors investing into projects that are promising, transformative, disruptive, innovative, it's a myth. Right now we have institutions like the government of Saudi Arabia, which gave $40 billion to SoftBank, whose whole purpose now is to go and find these promising seeds of the sharing economy, which might transform how we do business, and offer them as a service everywhere, as a homogeneous product. Right? So many of the trends we've seen before, with Walmart, with McDonald's, with other institutions which essentially achieve scale, and through scale they dominate local providers, we're seeing it repeat itself, but sort of on steroids. Because everything is driven, but how big the provider of the capital is. And we will never be able to fight that struggle unless we manage to somehow go beyond just the local and try to understand what kind of national and global institutions we need to have in place for true interdependence to ensure that all of these promising seeds are not completely eradicated. Because in as much as there is at least some tiny profits to be made in the provision of the services, once you offer it at global scale, which is what all of these institutions aspire to do, there is almost no way to compete with them, right? And for me, that is the greatest problem. And in a sense, we're actually returning back to the problem we thought we have solved, because we are back to the world of centralization. It's just that that centralization now is no longer driven and dominated by the technocrats sitting in government offices, but instead it's dominated by people sitting in Google or sitting in SoftBank, who basically decide that we would like to roll out just one model everywhere, and that model is going to serve you, and that's it. There is no idea that you yourself would try to understand what your local problem is and take full advantage of artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, big data, to create some kind of a local sustainable solution that would address your need. Your need is to be offered to you as a service that you can then go buy from Amazon or from SoftBank or from Uber or from Airbnb. And the entire sort of menu, right, of problems that we face, and there are many, on which we can be working collaboratively, driven by the ideas of cooperation and solidarity, becomes just a battlefield where we're expected to go and purchase solutions from one giant global provider, right? So this is where we really have to understand how this dynamic of the local and the global works. And it pains me to say that, but inventions like the internet, which made the local available to the global and mostly for exploitation, they became key drivers of these processes, right? And unless we manage to invent institutions, both technological ones, political ones, and legal ones, that would allow us to reverse that process and to empower people by supplying them with access to those technologies on their own terms, not just as consumers of services, but as actual creators who perceive a certain problem and see a certain problem in their neighborhood and would like to mobilize their fellow citizens to go out and solve it, right? They would like to be empowered and not to be kind of treated only as consumers who are there to purchase an app that they will install on their phone that will help them somehow become more efficient at adapting to the world that they can no longer transform. And and this is where on which I would like to end on this point, that much of the innovation that we celebrate right now, and there is plenty of that celebration in any newspaper, in any policy conference, much of that innovation is deeply conservative. That innovation does not seek to transform reality. It seeks to make it easier for us to adapt to a reality that is presumed to be unchangeable, right? Most of these apps and technologies that we celebrate, they are there to make it easier for us to survive and to adapt to what we perceive to be something that we cannot transform. It's extremely conservative, right? It's all about adopting to the status quo. And on this, I think we really have to develop a different idea of innovation. We need to have innovation that allows us to transform reality and not just to adapt to it, right? And this is where we really need to start thinking of data and artificial intelligence not just as tools, but as infrastructures, as institutions, as something that we can actually mobilize to enable people, citizen associations, NGOs, entrepreneurs, and so on, to take advantage of them for their own transformative projects. Otherwise, we'll end up in a world where all of these resources serve just one function, and that's occasionally enriching the investors behind them, like the government of Saudi Arabia, which is the largest investor in this field because they're running out of oil money eventually. Or it will be to generate those giant piles of bikes, which is the normal consequence of the irrationality of competition, because you don't know how many bikes you'll actually need to have in place in order to dominate the market. So with that, I'd like to end, and I just would like you to keep remembering this idea that what passes for innovation right now is nothing of the kind. What we celebrate as innovation now mostly is adaptation. True radical innovation is about transforming reality and not just swallowing it in ways that may be more palatable or that may be actually easier to swallow. Right? Unfortunately, Silicon Valley just wants us to keep swallowing reality and not transforming it. Thank you very much.
Before I leave maybe the questions to the room, I have one regarding what you say. I agree with you 100% of this idea of innovation that is being, in the end, not radical enough and really conservative, especially with this idea of decentralization that is a myth that is not ready to happen. In a way, like, I'm part of a group who listens and works on AI on small data sets, to avoid the idea that we should do AI only when we have like a huge data set and apply deep learning to it, which interestingly enough was actually technology within AI that we forgot to use because of this huge methodology around platform and the need to centralize all the data and work towards it. But there are a few projects that are interesting enough to me in terms of possible decentralization, even through these kind of technologies, with small data sets, sometimes called artificial imagination and things like this, when, for instance, it's imagined that all of us would have some kind of digital twin that could basically connect with one another without having to always centralize all information, so that we wouldn't have like this kind of Uber stuff taking 25% out of each transaction, but just having this kind of peer-to-peer on a very global scale. Applications, obviously led and powered through blockchain and so on. So I see those kind of initiatives that obviously don't go really far so far because they're not pushed by the imagination and methodology that we do have. But do you have a few examples maybe that empower this idea of going from customer to creator and not being basically an instrument of the system, but trying to really be part and actor of it?
Mm-hmm. Well, sort of, let me take it in steps. So I think, you know, the final objective should, of course, be decentralization in the sense that we enable citizens to take more decision-making about their own lives in their own hands. Right? So what we would like to do is to enhance the agency of people and to widen the scope of what it is in their own lives that they decide themselves. That's not pushed on them from above, that's not imposed on them by Facebook, that's not imposed on them by Amazon. Under contemporary conditions, under the current global economic system, with, again, centralization of capital happening, with the ability to extract value in a centralized manner by means of digital technologies, this project of decentralization is only possible under the conditions of centralized project that seeks to protect these initiatives from these external threats. So this is why I think people who would like to substitute this centralization element with a technological solution, be it the blockchain or be it some kind of a decentralized protocol, I think they're living in a dream world. You will need to have a solution that will be able to imagine the nation state and the European context, the European Union, as a bulwark against these processes that will create the right conditions for this decentralization to happen. That decentralization is only possible under the conditions of centralization. I'm completely convinced of that. The idea of creation and not just consumption, I think you don't need any high-profile examples of that in our everyday life. We are not just consumers, we're also parents, we are educators, we are citizens, we are neighbors. And as we go about our life, Of course, we coordinate with each other, we collaborate, we create solutions. Something breaks down in my neighbor's house, I go and I help them with some kind of ingenuity that I have. The problem is that most of our economic and political theories about modernity and the present, they present us as a one-sided creatures that exist only in one domain. That domain is the marketplace, and the only way to coordinate there is the price mechanism, where I would not help my neighbor unless my neighbor tells me how much he's willing to pay me for helping him, right? Which of course not how the world works. We communicate in families without the price mechanism. I do not tell my family how much I'm willing to be paid in order to go and drive my siblings to the airport. We do not communicate that way, and we seem to be doing fine, right? And my bigger project intellectually is finding ways how we can scale that. Surely we can be helping each other outside of our immediate milieu. We just need the infrastructure for that, right? And we need to have the right ingredients in place to imagine a world beyond markets, where coordination through non-market mechanisms is a reality. And unfortunately, everything that's emerging and coming from Silicon Valley, but also from China to some extent, it imagines a world very differently. It does imagine a world where there is one domain, market coordination, and there is nothing else. And it just shrinks the complexity of our reality so much that I think we should all be rebelling against that.
Okay, so, yeah. So if I understood you correctly, you also mean that the way to basically scale this kind of initiative might go through technology itself, but in a new manner, in a new way, that would have to be maybe public-led in a way?
Well, sure, that's what I'm saying. But what I'm also saying is that, to some extent, it's easy to look out in reality out there and say, look, everybody is just a consumer, and everybody thinks of everything just in terms of price and of maximizing efficiency. But is it a kind of an ontological condition of the world, or is it a historical condition? In other words, is it the result of conscious policy over the last 30 years that we cannot think in other terms, or is it how we really are? And the reality, of course, that it's a result of conscious policy. If you do not create spaces and infrastructures of collaboration and infrastructures of cooperation, it's no wonder that people turn to the only mechanism available, which is the market. And this is where I think our thinking should be. How to deploy AI, big data, and technology to create these alternative infrastructures so that people can cooperate with each other through mechanisms other than the price. Because otherwise we'll end up in a world where everything looks like the search pricing mechanism of Uber. Where the resources are scarce, when there are not enough drivers, price goes up. When the resources are not scarce, price goes down. And that becomes the tool through which we perceive reality. And it's just a horrible way to perceive it, which I think will lead us to disaster much faster that will get us out of it.
Wonderful. I now understand that I want to collaborate with you on the AI comments. It's exactly the question that we are asking ourselves every day, like how to basically build this infrastructure to make sure we kind of rise a new model also to it. I'd love to open the questions to the room if there are maybe some. I don't know how much time we have actually. 1 minute, so one question. If there are any. Yeah.
Sorry. Hi, thanks for your talk. I'm wondering, based on the discussion, do you think that the implementation of a minimum global income would help with what you just said in the last few sentences?
Me? Particularly? Yeah. Yes. I think it will help in the sense that it will allow to enhance the agency of the people, not to be dependent on things on which they shouldn't be dependent. And I just don't think that the accident of birth should determine whether we are slaves, to put it euphemistically, or whether we're masters, right? So in that sense, if we can equalize that and enable, at the same time, access to infrastructures in a way that will not be determined by permissions that are set by service providers, that will not be determined by usage fees, but will be determined the way it used to be determined in Europe. Infrastructure is public, and anybody who wants to use it can use it. So if you have those two conditions, people on a minimum income of some kind, with access to the most powerful infrastructures that can only exist, I do think we'll see much more progress that would not just be progress that's determined by venture capital or global capital of the soft bank variety. People will be able to take risks, and they will be able to take risks in a way that will get them away from the only path that exists now. And the only path that exists now is go and found a startup. You know, how do you change the world? You found a startup. I mean, 30 years ago, it would look ridiculous, but this is the reality we're in now. There is no other path available, and everybody has to do it.
Another question? Yeah.
Now, thank you so much for this talk, and I wanted to ask you a question, actually, both of you, and it refers to what I said earlier this morning, you know, when I reported my recent conversations with Tim Berners-Lee, who, of course, on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the World Wide Web, which happened in March 2019, alerted us all once more on this extreme danger that actually this idea of the internet being an infrastructure for everyone risks to be lost. And he, of course, started this foundation. I just wanted to ask you how you see his endeavor in relation to your endeavor, and if you collaborate.
Sure. Why don't you start, because it's a bit related to our comments.
Yeah, obviously. So I do share the exact same point of view that the overall dream of the global village that would have been the internet to overcome any frontier and being able to build some kind of new society, utopian one, where we would collaborate equally, is being obviously damaged by the whole fight over the neutrality of the net and so forth. So we do share exactly the same kind of interests and fights. We actually work with this foundation within the AI for Good Commission to understand how to push this forward. And exactly what you said, our idea with the AI Commons, with this specific platform itself, is trying to rebuild the same kind of imaginary through sharing resources for AI. We don't think of it as a second internet, obviously, but as a way of collaborating for the common good within resources that could be shared only within the internet. So it's kind of a smaller village within an exploded one, but it's still exactly the same kind of routes that we are trying to take.
Well, I respect Tim Berners-Lee enormously, and you know it's not a good sign when you begin with something like that, but anyway, I respect him enormously, and I respect everything he says. What troubles me is mostly what he doesn't say. And what he doesn't say is the following. Technology policy, as we have discovered in the last few months because of the US-China conflict, technology policy has always been also an industrial policy and a trade policy. Right? It was not a matter of designing just nice standards and designing some kind of protocols that will communicate with each other in a way that will protect our privacy and will store our data. Those protocols are essential. So Tim Berners-Lee is now building something called Solid. It's fantastic. We should have more of that. But the problem with the discourse that emerges from institutions like MIT is their inability to situate that technological policy in relation to everything else. So, okay, we build those protocols, and then what happens? Would that be enough? Do we need to have other infrastructures in place that will help to protect us from, I don't know, SoftBank? Do we need to have other things in the right? How will we enforce those rights? You know, if you're telling me that I can have all the privacy I want, but the only way for me to get public transportation in my city at night is by using Uber, which will mean that I'll have to share my data with them, does my right to privacy matter? Right? Are those rights enforceable, even if they are built into technologies? So my kind of concern in that discourse is that it risks getting us into this technocratic engineering mindset where we think that we can just design fantastic protocols, but we would never worry about conditions of possibility that would actually make them enforceable. And to think about conditions of possibility for the enforcement, you really have to broaden up the box and present technological policy, as I said, as something that's deeply geopolitical and as something that's deeply economic. And you have to be able to relate your solution to that wider, broader context, because otherwise, those are just blueprints that will never match reality, because reality is shaped by conflict. I know it's not something pleasant to say in a setting like this, where we talk about cooperation, but in the international scale, that's how reality is shaped. And our solutions have to be adequate for that reality.